Hey there, everyone. Thank you for watching. As always, I really do appreciate it. I have to tell you that I have a thing for hand planes. Ever since I got into woodworking, once I finally got my hands on a good quality hand plane, something about this hand tool just intrigued me. I love the amount of control it gives you over the wood removal process. So much so that when I be out and about at a woodworking show or a woodworking supply store, something like that, if I came across a unique hand plane that I didn't already have, if I could justify in my mind a time or two when I might be able to use that hand plane, the desire to acquire it was strong. And that's why years ago, when I was at a woodworking show, walking around, and went into the Lee Nielsen booth and saw this guy, I was like, yeah, this is coming home with me. I mean, after all, it came with its own sock. And they had one there in the booth, so I thought, why not? So I bought it. And so here I am walking around the trade show with this box in my hand. And then I wander into the Powermatic booth. And I don't recall the conversation exactly that I had with the salesman. But, nice stuff. I was looking around and whatnot, and he saw the big box in my hand. And the conversation basically went like this, great equipment, the joiner I was looking at, but not sure I need it. I have this, but hey, nice equipment. And I laughed. And I do recall, though, as I was leaving, the salesman looked at me and smiled and just said, "You'll be back." And he was right. Not sure how many years later it was, but I did end up going back and getting a joiner. No regrets on this piece of equipment, this hand plane. I love it, still use it. Matter of fact, when I made the sideboard, there's a link to that sideboard in the description for this channel. I use this hand plane to shape the drawer. So, no regrets, great plane, love it. But yeah, if you are looking for equipment, still kind of expanding your shop and whatnot, and not sure what to buy next, and you don't have a joiner, yeah, I would say it's a good piece of equipment to acquire. So that is what this episode is about, the joiner. More specifically, 5 points that I wanted to share with you on how to safely and effectively use this piece of equipment, if you have one, or if you're thinking of buying one and you're somewhat new to the joiner. All right, so let's get started. So here I am, sitting at my joiner in this very intimate setting. I apologize for the weird angle, but there's this pole here that's holding up my house that I can't move, so I'm gonna start here, I figured. And the first thing I would say for safety is these glasses. Never a bad idea to wear safety glasses. This is not a particularly loud piece of equipment, so I don't usually wear ear protection, but in terms of PPE, glasses. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about for this piece of equipment is the type of stock you might want to use on this piece of equipment. Typically, again, to keep things safe, I would not suggest trying to joint a piece of stock that's narrower than 1/2 inch, just because keeping it stable could be a thing. I wouldn't try to joint the face of a piece of wood that's thinner than 1/2 inch. Again, just getting kind of close to the blade for me. And I wouldn't try to join a piece of stock that's shorter than, let's say, about 8 to 10 inches long. Again, just based on how you use and guide this over the joiner, getting less than 8 inches, you could be putting yourself in an unsafe situation. Next thing is, and I wouldn't do this, I'm just doing this for illustration purposes, is when you're guiding a piece of stock or lumber over the joiner, don't use your fingers like this to push it along, kind of for obvious reasons. I mean, the way you're using this equipment, you have no good way of knowing, I don't think, where your hands are, and it's just too dangerous. So always use like, a push stick, I'll get into that, or something mechanical to guide the workpiece. Don't use your fingers, at least on the back end. Obviously the top end you should be pressing down, and I'll talk about that. In talking about things to use to advance the workpiece over the joiner, these push pads came with the joiner actually for me. I'm pretty sure they came with it. But if you ever used these things before, you might have experienced, wood gets dusty or whatever, and these things might tend to slide over when you're trying to advance the workpiece. So I use some spray adhesive and just put some 120 grit sandpaper on these to help with the grip. So these are definitely good to advance the workpiece and to make sure you're keeping pressure down on the cutters. And also, again, in place of using your fingers to kind of push a piece along on the back, this is just a shop-made jig that I've used to, again, advance the workpiece this way. So I'm not using my hand to kind of push it, but using a jig. So these are 3 things at a minimum I would suggest you have on the ready by your joiner when you're using it. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is just in general how to advance a workpiece over the cutters. Now later I'll get into how to deal with like cut boards, bowed boards, and that kind of thing. But here, again, just in general, how to advance the workpiece past the cutter. You want to make sure and have good, even downward pressure on the workpiece. Advance it slowly. And then as you go over the cutter, and I'll demonstrate this, as soon as possible, you want to transfer the pressure to the part that's on the outfeed table to keep that flat, and then pull the workpiece past the cutter completely. I'll show you what I'm talking about. The reason for doing that is this outfeed table is the key reference point you're going for. This flatness and so forth is what you're going for. This infeed table is there to support the workpiece as you're feeding it, but you're going for this. So again, as soon as possible as you're advancing the workpiece, transfer the pressure to the outfeed table and keep the workpiece steady as you continue to pull it past the cutter head. Okay, the next point I'm going to talk about is fence and outfeed table height settings. In terms of the fence, I pretty much keep mine at 90 degrees at all times. Find a good tool to set this fence at 90 degrees. You can adjust the fence, but again, my recommendation would be set this at 90 degrees and pretty much leave it there, unless you have a real good reason to change it. Okay, the next thing is outfeed table height. You want to set the height of the outfeed table such that as you advance the workpiece past the cutter, the workpiece smoothly slides onto the outfeed table and meets that table flat and stays there through the duration of the cut. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay, I stopped the piece so you can see what I'm talking about. You see how I started to advance the workpiece. You can see where I started to join it right there and stopped. And as I went over the workpiece, you see it's very smoothly transitioning onto the outfeed table and is flat. That is the proper height you want for your outfeed table. If the outfeed table is set too high, you're going to bump into it like that when you're trying to advance the workpiece. And if the outfeed table is set too low, as you join your piece, you're basically going to be tapering it. As you join, you're going to be, as you go over the cutter, you're going like this, and you're going to be adding a taper to your piece, which you don't want. So again, you want the outfeed table set so that as you go past the blade, the workpiece meets the other side, the outfeed table, flat, and stays that way for the duration of the cut. The next suggestion I would make is don't try to take off too much wood at one time. If you look at this gauge here for the infeed table, it goes up to like a 1/2 inch. I have never tried to take off a 1/2 inch of material at one point on this joiner. I can't imagine ever doing that. I keep it really at this first tick mark. It's around a 1/16 of an inch or less. Now, if you're working with really rough lumber that's really poorly, it's cupped or bowed, you might need to get a little more aggressive for that first cut. But, most of the lumber I use from my lumber supplier is kiln dried, good quality lumber. It's not really rough. Again, if it's really long, I'll have them put a straight line on it. So most of what I'm using my joiner for is if I cut a piece on the table saw and let's say it freaks out a little bit or bows or something like that, which I kind of talked about in another episode, then I will take that piece over to my joiner here, straight line it again to continue working with it. But again, I'll show you, processing a rougher piece of lumber on this joiner. But for the most part, I keep it at about a 1/16 of an inch or less for the setting in terms of the material I'm taking off at any one time. The next thing is, as you're using the joiner, in order to more evenly distribute the wear on the cutting blades, just be aware of the position of the fence and just, move it around every now and then. For a while, use it, towards the end. For a while, use it in the middle, and then go back here again, just to distribute the wear on the knives. Just, be cognizant of the position of the fence and just alternate it every now, or move it around every now and then. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about here is how to get at and adjust the blades on the joiner. Now, of course, I have a Powermatic joiner, and so the procedures I'm going to go through, obviously, for my joiner, and they won't necessarily be the same for all products out there. If you have a different type of joiner, obviously check the manual that came with it. Nonetheless, regardless of what type of joiner that you have, being able to obviously get at and adjust the blades will be something you'll want to know. Because, as I mentioned, most of the lumber that I use is, pretty good wood. I don't use a whole lot of rough sawn lumber. So my lumber supplier, as a standard, it's S2S, kiln dried lumber. And as I mentioned, since, I don't have the room in my shop to put a big in-feed and out-feed, support structure in place to do long stock, most of the long stock I buy from my lumber supplier, I had them straight line for me anyway. So I haven't had to really change the blades on my joiner here very often. As a matter of fact, I think this is just the second set of blades that I have on this joiner, and the blades are two-sided so you can rotate them. However, one thing you might want to do from time to time, depending upon, if you've ever, used a joiner and you notice little beads on the join end, that might be due to a nick or something like that you got somehow in your cutting blade. If you go in and adjust one of the blades, side to side, such that that nick is not in the same area for all three blades, you can remove that without having to change the blade. So that's something you might want to get in here and do, even if you're not changing the blades altogether. It's just, adjusting it from side to side. Okay, so are some of the tools that you'll need to mess around with the blades on your joiner. And again, depending on what kind of joiner you have, look at the manual, because there might be some differences, obviously. But again, for Powermatic, this is a model 5A, and I'd imagine Jet is likely the same. This will be what you need. I have a straight edge here. I'm using an aluminum one, but a straight edge, a piece of scrap wood to move the blades or to seat the blade. I have some of this solution that actually I got years ago, mostly for hand planes, but when I take the blades out, I'll put some of this on. There's like an oil, basically, to help, reduce the likelihood of rust. I'll go ahead and clean the blades up with some of that and some shop towels. And then these Allen wrenches or hex wrenches are just based on what the specs say are required to get to the locking and adjusting bolts for the cutter head. And I should point out, again, for this joiner, for my joiner, the blades are pretty easy to set. Basically, there's the locking screws that hold the blade in place, and behind there on the head, there are a set of cams that you can adjust to raise and lower the blade so that it's even. So I know that, some older joiners, perhaps, you might need a special jig or a different jig to kind of hold the blades up using magnets to adjust the height. That system is not needed for this joiner. As a matter of fact, I didn't realize that, quite honestly, when I first got this jig. So if you're familiar with that system and you see these little marks on my fence, I was trying to use it, but after I, had it for a while and decided to go back and look at the instructions, I realized that I didn't need that sort of thing. So, but for this joiner, again, it's pretty easy to set the blades. So the first thing I'm going to do is loosen up the bolts that hold the blade in place, just to get at the blade. And here is the blade, one of them. And these are those cams that are used to adjust the height of the blade. But basically the way this works is that when the blade is in there and all the way down, and you can use on the back here, a little pulley system to adjust it. When the blade is in here and all the way down, which you would test with a piece of wood, it should be even or parallel with the outfeed table. So that's what I'm going to test here to make sure it is, and if it isn't, I'll make an adjustment. So now the height, if the height is correct, when I rotate the belt here, the blade should just touch the straight edge. And and it's not quite what it was on the other end. I already did the first blade, so let me raise this up a little bit. So I'm going to loosen the cam locking screws. And turn the cam just a little bit to raise it. Okay. That's about where the other table was. You can kind of see just a little bit. It's touching, so let me do the other side. Not quite. Make sure the blade is seated. Not quite. There you go. I think that's good. So then first, before I tighten the cams, I'm actually going to tighten the screws that hold the blade in place, because I notice when I do that, tighten the cams first, the cams rotate a little bit and the adjustment's really sensitive. So, and now tighten the cam locking screws. And that's it. So basically I will do that for just one more set, or one more blade in here, number 3. Do the same thing and then test it. All right, now let me test the table. That is pretty good. Now I'm going to try to joint 2 surfaces of a piece of rough sawn lumber. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I don't work a whole lot with rough sawn lumber, but I got some wood. A friend of mine whose father passed away not long ago, who was into woodworking, and she gave me a bunch of good lumber. I think it's a piece of hickory that I'm keeping to, I've worked on a couple of projects, but this is a piece I have left over I haven't worked with yet. Again, it's rough sawn, and I need to clean it up here a little bit on the joiner before I then go to the planer to make the other side parallel to the jointed side before I can work with it. But I just want to show you here some things to consider when working with a piece of rough sawn lumber on the joiner. And one thing you want to keep in mind is, I mentioned earlier that you don't want to take a whole lot off at once. This is one exception where you might want to get a little more aggressive, maybe up to a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch, just to start to get the piece flat as soon as possible. And likewise, you want to push the piece over with the side that causes the least amount of rocking first. And with rough sawn lumber, I know for me it's kind of hard to see which way the grain is going, so I kind of make a guess, do it once, and with one pass you should know if you're going in the right direction or not. So let me just start with this side. That's pretty good. And I think I'm going in the right direction. I'm not sure if you heard that, but I think this looks pretty good, and I'm going in the right direction. So, and I got kind of a lot off that first time, so I'm gonna reduce the amount of cut to what I usually do and keep working with it. One more pass should be enough. Yeah, that's pretty good. So now to this side. Yeah, this is pretty good. Now I have two sides, and if I were just going to complete the milling process, I would then take this over to my planer to get this other side parallel with this, and I could work with it. So there you go. All right, I hope that you found this useful. If you did, please subscribe to my channel so you can get notifications of future content. And bye for now.